listener production.
Hi, Natarsha Belling with you and welcome to the afternoon edition of The Briefing. Coming up in our deep dive, the Optus disaster. How did the Telecommunications Giant allow a systems upgrade to cripple its emergency 000 network, with at least 3 people dying during the outage? We'll unpack all the details and the consequences Optus may face. But first, let's check the afternoon headlines this Monday, the 22nd of September. The US government is set to make a major announcement tomorrow on autism, as foreshadowed by President Donald Trump. The US president teasing the so-called breakthrough earlier today when he was speaking at Charlie Kirk's memorial service.
And tomorrow we're going to have one of the biggest announcements, really medically, I think, in the history of our country. We're going to be doing it with Bobby and Oz and all of the professionals. I think you're going to find it to be amazing. I think we found an answer to autism. How about that? Autism. Tomorrow, we're going to be talking in the Oval Office in the White House about autism.
Tens of thousands of people attended the public memorial service for the right-wing activist who was assassinated while speaking at a uni campus in Utah 2 weeks ago. His widow, Erica, also spoke at the service, saying she forgave her husband's accused killer. The RBA governor has warned high prices are here to stay, saying Australians will continue to pay more for everything. Speaking at the House of Representatives Standing Committee on Economics, Michelle Bullock says high inflation is pushing prices up across the board, admitting while inflation is falling, price levels are not coming back down and will not return to pre-COVID levels. Governor Bullock also confirmed the cost of major renovations at the RBA headquarters in Sydney has blown out to $1.2 billion, with authorities miscalculating costs by more than $740 million because of asbestos issues. And filming has been suspended on the set of the new Spider-Man movie after star Tom Holland was involved in an accident. It's believed the actor was injured during a stunt gone wrong and suffered mild concussion. Tom was hospitalised but is expected to return to filming in a few days. Now it's time to get into our deep dive on the Optus disaster with tech expert Trevor Long. It's the second time the telco giant has failed customers over the past 2 years, with pressure now growing on the new CEO. Federal Communications Minister Anika Wells says Optus has failed the Australian people and the company would face significant consequences. But how does this happen again? And why didn't Optus have adequate safety measures in place? Plus, what does this latest monumental failure say about Australia's telecommunications industry? Trevor, thanks so much for joining us. This is a monumental disaster. When you started to understand the details of it, could you believe it?
Not at all, Tash. This is something we've never seen before because, look, I've covered cyber attacks, network outages, 000 outages before, but there's never been one that, firstly, we can pinpoint was associated with tragic deaths. So that's the first thing here. A telco outage and deaths are not things that we would normally be talking about together. So that's challenging in and of itself. But the thing here is this was not a network outage. Everything was working fine. If you're in South Australia, Western Australia, the Northern Territory where this occurred, your phones were working fine all day Thursday. You didn't notice something was happening unless you were in your most time of need to call 000. That was the only time you knew it didn't work.
Okay, there's a lot of detail to get through here, Trevor, but let's go back to the beginning. From what we can understand, Optus was actually conducting a network upgrade. Can I ask 2 questions there? Was it just a standard network upgrade? Was it being upgraded with systems here in Australia? Was it offshore? And what happened?
So it was I call it an IT upgrade only because the use of the word network confuses me when we're talking about mobile networks. So an IT upgrade, there's a piece of equipment, a firewall is what it's called, which, stops some traffic getting in and out, cybersecurity style. It was just a software upgrade. It was just a change. It might have been a piece of hardware was 20 years old, needed to be replaced. It might have been that they had a new version of software like we all do when we get updates to our technology. It was routine by every measure, according to the people I've spoken to. What we now know is that something was not done according to normal processes and procedures, and that caused this to slip through the keeper and go wrong. But critically here, this IT upgrade was done at 12:30 a.m. Thursday morning, middle of the night, as you would do these things. And then they went through a little checklist and they thought, is everything working? Probably made some phone calls, looked at the dashboards that said, is everything good on the network? And yes, it was all fine. There was no indication of a problem from Optus's level. There was no indication. And it wasn't until 13 hours later that they went, oh, wow, that worked, but something failed, turn it back. And they simply, and I would think it was a 5-minute job, they turned it back and everything was fine again.
Was that network upgrade, I know there's an investigation underway, but have you heard any speculation about whether it was done by teams here in Australia or was it done offshore?
It is a question that they will need to answer. I suspect they will avoid the question until there's been a full investigation, because the CEO, Stephen Rue, has said that he'll have an independent third-party perform an investigation. Look, I could speculate, and everything I'm about to say is speculation. It's highly likely they have outsourced some IT functions, which is not unusual in any company, especially that large. It's quite likely there were people both locally and outsourced involved in this change. Who that responsible person was that made the error or didn't follow procedure, we don't know.
And from what we can understand, Optus didn't realise there was an issue until members of the public actually called their call centres, which importantly were offshore, these call centres, and those operators did not escalate it to the right level, correct?
This is a critical part of the timeline. The earliest call we're aware of was at 9 a.m, so let's call that 8 and a bit hours after the change was made, so we can assume that the 000 network was down for 8 and a bit hours. Someone called the call centre at 9 a.m. and said, I just tried to call 000, it didn't work. Now, in the defence of that call centre operator, onshore or offshore, I think they probably went, okay, let me look into that. And they looked at a dashboard, a system dashboard, and said, there's no sign of a problem in our network. So my advice is to turn it off, turn it back on again, go into airplane mode, the basic things that any IT support person would do. And then it went on. And there were 4 other calls. So a total of 5 calls that we know of thus far went through to a call centre and were treated like that. They were handled like there was no problem. And that's what's being investigated by the Telecommunications Industry Ombudsman. At 1:30 p.m. on Thursday, a call got through that did raise the attention of the call centre operator or management. And that's when they went, hang on a minute, what's going on? And at 1:50 p.m. on Thursday, the South Australian Police called Optus and said, hey, we think there's a problem with your 000 system. And at that moment, I don't know, I've asked the question, but it's probably within the hour of them knowing that, the upgrade was reversed and the systems were back online.
May seem like a pretty silly question to ask you, Trevor. Why doesn't Optus have its own warning system in place that if there is some type of issue with 000, because these are emergency calls that people call when they're in real trouble, why don't they have an internal system that alerts the highest people in the company, hey, we've got a major problem here?
Yeah, I think every telco would probably, I don't think they'd ever admit it, but I bet you any money that the other big telco networks on the weekend went, we need to put in place a system that checks 000 regularly because, Tash, normally 000 is only an issue when your network goes down. So big red lights, big alarms go off saying, the network's down in this town, in this centre, this tower's offline, whatever it might be, or the whole country's offline like it was in 2023. At that point, it should be the case that your customers, in fact, will have access to 000 because the whole purpose of the 000 mobile function is that if you're an Optus customer and you're not in an Optus service area or the Optus network is down, you'll use the Telstra tower or a Vodafone tower to call 000. That function didn't kick in because the mobile network wasn't offline. So essentially, and this is kind of wild to say, but I don't think anyone was checking 000 independently of the network because they always assumed that if the network was up, the 000 was up. And frankly, rightly so, they should have assumed that. But we now know that there is some line of code, some problem potentially in any network that could cause 000 to independently be offline. And for that reason, Optus most certainly today is now monitoring on a greater scale 000 independently. And I bet you the other networks are doing the same.
Just on that point, Trevor, interesting you mentioned that because the Telecommunications Emergency Call Service Determination Act of 2019 sets out actually obligations on telecommunications companies to ensure they have arrangements in place for dealing with emergency calls. Now, we know this is the latest disaster involving Optus. They had a similar outage less than 2 years ago, and Telstra has also had an issue with 000 calls. Surely this just is not good enough.
Look, it's definitely not good enough. No, I don't think anyone would argue that. But I read a bit of the regulations and requirements under law, and in fact, in many ways, Optus is not in breach of many of them in the way we think they are. Because, for example, the minister and an ACMA representative, I think the ACMA chair today, talked about how Optus didn't tell them until the problem was resolved. Well, actually, Optus didn't know until the problem was resolved. So there was no outage window in which Optus knew there was an outage for them to tell the regulators, if you understand what I mean. So it's very different. There's no playbook for this kind of outage. The Telstra outages we've talked about, the previous Optus outage occurred when the network was down, i.e. when no phone calls could be made. And that's when the backup plan is meant to come into place. You're meant to be able to use another telco automatically. That didn't occur here because the network wasn't down. So this is an unprecedented outage, technically, from Optus's perspective and in Australian mobile network history, that I don't think anyone could have foreseen, but it just starts the questions of what else could go wrong. And frankly, what fundamentally is wrong with the Optus IT infrastructure, because Tash, the outage they had nationally in 2023 was a network upgrade of some sort again. It was routers that were configured incorrectly. So this is the second time they've had a failing of great measure related to their IT infrastructure. So that's where the questions will be asked. But I think that from a government perspective, I'm not making light of it, but I don't think Optus did too much wrong in the reporting of it, because there wasn't an outage to report that they were aware of.
In regards to, we know there's going to be investigations, more recommendations will be handed down. From your professional opinion, how much has this got to do by this growing trend in corporate Australia, profits above people, outsourcing a lot of stuff that we know if it was here on Australian shores with the tech experts that may cost more long term, they'll actually get it right? How much of this is an issue, profit before people?
It's impossible to say, but I think we'll find out very quickly, because if they truly have a transparent review where an independent third party can look at those things, and if, as you suggested earlier, potentially offshore IT workers were at all involved in this, then huge questions will be asked around that. And look, I feel almost racist having suggested this week that an overseas call centre staff member receiving a call about 000, maybe they didn't understand how important 000 is. Maybe they thought of it as just like a phone number for shopping. I don't know. We don't know that. And it's wrong to say that, but it's also important that we check that, because if that simple fundamental thing caused this not to be escalated, then that may have played a part in people not receiving care on Thursday. And that's tragic.
Tragic indeed. Trevor, there's also pressure on the new CEO, who I think has been in the job for 10 months. Mm-hmm. Do you think this is something that the CEO should go over, or do you think this is more of a problem of not leadership, but systematic flaws within the system?
I'll be very clear here. I met with Stephen Rue before he took the job, because I had dealt with him at NBN, and I did think him to be a good leader there. And I've since met with him at Optus and interviewed him in his time at Optus. I see him as a pretty darn good leader. I don't think it's right to suggest that a CEO leaves or is sacked over something like this, because right now that company needs leadership. That company needs to be led through a crisis. I called very strongly and openly for the resignation of the previous CEO, because at the time of their data breach and outage, they were not communicating with the public. They were not communicating with their customers. They failed their customers, I believe, in communication of a crisis. And I think that was on that CEO. This time around, I think the CEO is being extremely transparent. He had 3 press conferences in 3 days, probably overkill in many ways, and answered every question. Tash, I turned up to one of the press conferences with 8 questions, all of which he answered in his statement before we even got to questions because they were so transparent. So, no, I think the company needs leadership right now, but it does suggest to me that there are some fundamental problems within their IT networking teams, their infrastructure teams, and I worry how long that takes to weed out and change.
And in regards to the calls for the CEO to go, you and I know 101 is if you want to bury a story, you have a news conference or send out a press release on a Friday afternoon. Now, in their defence, they may have received this information, had everything in order and wanted to inform the public and not hold over till Saturday morning. What are your thoughts on that?
What I say to you right now is based purely on what we know at the time of recording. So in the weeks and months ahead, don't hate me because the timeline changed. But the timeline as we know it today is outage occurred Thursday midnight into Thursday morning. The company was aware of it 1 o'clock Thursday afternoon and fixed it, I assume, by 2 o'clock. And then it give them 2 to 3 hours to download all of their network information and find out how many people tried to call 000. Then they get a list. It's 600 people. Their requirement under regulation, and a thing they got fined $12 million for not doing previously, is to perform welfare checks on those 600 people. It's their obligation to call twice each of those people or attempt to call twice, and if they cannot contact them, to hand that information on to the police. My understanding is Optus started that process on Thursday evening and went through Friday, and they wanted to complete that process to have a holistic, statement to make before they spoke publicly about it. They called the press conference at 4 o'clock. I rang my contacts, Tash, at Optus, and they were clearly moved. It was clearly a problem, so it's a big problem. I could feel it in my bones. And I went to the press conference, and Tash, with 30 minutes to go, people in the room, media in the room, realised it was a 000 issue because by then the federal minister had been made aware of this, and her office or their office had started, leaking's the wrong word, but started disseminating that information. If Optus had rung every premier and every, agency earlier in the day, the story would have spread like wildfire before they had measure of the extent of the issue. So I don't think they wanted to bury the story. I think it worked out to be a bad time for them, and they did. I think they came out as quickly as we've ever seen before. We've never seen a company a victim of have such an incident and speak so quickly. So there's a bit of both ways. If the timeline though proves that they knew about the deaths and and they'd spoken to everyone by midday, then it's on them for not calling the press conference at 1 o'clock.
We really appreciate your analysis. Fantastic as always. Thanks so much, Trevor.
Cheers, Tash.
That was tech expert Trevor Long. And that's it for this episode of the afternoon edition of The Briefing. We'd love you to subscribe or follow us on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast, and we'll be back in your feed tomorrow morning. I'm Natarsha Belling. Thanks for your company.